Welcome to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon to all things digital in manufacturing. In today's episode, Jonathan Scott and Jen Ferello explore business systems every manufacturer needs. Using a model of how a product is made in an organization, they stir up the acronym soup of business systems, from ERP to CRM to PLM, and discuss it one spoonful at a time. Thanks for joining us, and here's Jen and Jonathan.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp. I am Jen Ferello, and I'm joined again today with my colleague, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
We are back talking to you about all things digital, and today we're going to dig deeper into a topic that a lot of people wonder about, and some people think they know what it is, but we're going to make sure that you do. All right, so Jonathan, we're going to talk today about PLM. What is PLM?
PLM. So that's an excellent entry point, Jen, right? That a lot of people think they know what it is. And I'm probably one of those people. I think I know what it is, or at least I know what I think it is. How about that?
There you go.
But let's start with the alphabet soup. So the acronym PLM, for most folks, is Product Lifecycle Management. Here's where it gets fun, though. I think the instant you say that, a lot of people are thinking, "Oh, it's Innovia, it's Windchill, it's Teamcenter, it's Aris, it's a PLM system." But there's this key word at the end, PLM system. Those things I named, they're all PLM systems. But PLM is managing the life cycle of a product. Not to be self-referential, but I think that's what it is. And I think that's where it's really important to dig into this topic, that everybody who makes a product does PLM in some form of another. They think about what they want to make, and then they make it. And so thinking about it is the first step in the life cycle, and making it is maybe another one. So there's your life cycle, right? It gets a lot more complicated than that. But if you're doing that, you're doing PLM. Where it gets tricky is when people blend that with PLM system and they think, "Oh, I don't have PLM." No, you do. But you may not like the tools you're using to do PLM. You may not have a system that ties all those tools together. There are lots of places where you may have gaps in your PLM strategy, that kind of thing. But from my perspective, that's what PLM is it's a collection of processes and practices and things like that relate to making products, designing and making products. So that's my take on it. Now, Jen, maybe you've got a different thought.
No, I think you're right. And I think it's an important distinction to draw that you don't have to have a PLM system. Hopefully, none of our partners are listening to this. You don't have to have a PLM system to do PLM. You and I were talking about the other day, and you started with a great story about a caveman and his use of PLM.
That's right. We've been doing PLM since the first caveman made a spear, right? That's okay. So now you've teed me up for it. Now I'm going to tell a story, right? What was the first product was the smarter caveman who figured out how to kill more animals and eat more food because he used a pointy stick, or a stick with a pointy rock on the end of it. But what does that have to do with PLM? It has everything to do with after he made the first one, and his caveman neighbor was like, "Ugh, me like that. Can I get one?" Right? He's like, "Oh, sure. Tell you what, for a couple of those grasses and berries, sure, I'll make you a spear." And off we went, right? That's the first product designer. And when he decided he wanted to make more than a couple, now maybe that's the difference between an artiste or a craftsman and a manufacturer. But let's assume our caveman was a manufacturer and he was going to make them for his whole tribe. He had to decide what it was he was making so that he could make another one. Because you can't make a second one that's like the first one unless there's some sort of template, right? Now, let's not get into the history of product development here necessarily, but because you could make one off of your first template. But let's assume that it was digital caveman. He had to have some standard, some specification for what he was making. And that's one of the first steps in a PLM process is you got to have an idea of what you want to make, and you got to document that somehow so that you can make another one. And I think, what was that? Was it a drawing on the cave wall? Probably, right? Oh yeah, here's the sharp pointy end rock. Here's the stick, and here's the grass I used to tie the rock to the stick. Great. 3-part assembly drawing right on the cave wall. Perfect. But that points out exactly, how you begin with PLM. A lot of people start, PLM processes with maybe even a PDM system because they want to manage drawings, specifications that say what we're going to make. So I think that's where PLM starts. Now, it gets a whole lot more complicated than that over time. So I'm going to keep with my story because I think my caveman story is a lot of fun.
I agree. So I want to know what happens when one of his neighbors came back and said, you know what, I need this for my son. And he can't have to stick a spear that heavy, or he needs a longer one, or you know what, I am going to go take down a mammoth, and this one that I've been killing bison with is just not cutting it.
And this is the essence of the life cycle part, right? Because the needs change. We didn't mention the caveman making requirements for his spear. Maybe he didn't at first because that's not something even everybody's good at even today. But let's say that a change was needed. To your point, I need a spear for my kid. I need a bigger spear for a woolly mammoth. So it's a change, right? So there's another one that's as old as time. Engineering change. PLM, of course, encompasses engineering change, a change to the design. So, PLM systems and the PLM process is going to manage that change where we can say, here's my idea for what's different, but now here is what has changed, what hasn't changed, how to make the new spear with the longer stick, with the, bigger rock at the tip, those kinds of things, needing new components. And it points to another thing that we need to do in our caveman PLM is we need to manage the materials that we're using to make this, right? So that gets us right to bill of materials. And creating a bill of materials is another important PLM function to know, these are selling so well, and I've got a large mammoth killer spear, and I've got a small saber-toothed tiger spear, and I'm selling a lot more of the saber-toothed tiger spears because it's safer to kill those. I don't know. They're faster, maybe not. But, so I know I need 10 of the little sticks and I need 5 of the big sticks. Oh, okay. So that's where knowing what you need for your product, your bill, comes in handy and is important to manage. And of course, that's another factor when you go to do engineering change later also. So now we've got several things fitting into that life cycle, which is the specification of the spear, the bill of materials to say what all the components are and how they come together and their quantities, and then a process to know which one am I making versus which were just ideas that maybe I discarded. Oh, that's a good idea, but that's not the one I'm going to go with, right? So how do things get released and I know exactly which one I want to make?
Well, and I think that when we were talking about the pieces and parts that go into each spear, right? There's some quality management approaches to that. Like, okay, this particular set of grass, this didn't work out well. It was breaking, and the rock was falling off the end of the spear all the time.
Yeah. So that one's perfect, right? Because that leads right into how do you try out the product while you're developing it, right? So we're going to make a new spear and we're going to use this rock we found down by the river. And but it turns out maybe it's too heavy. But how did I figure that out? I figured it out through prototyping, right? In today's world, maybe that's not physical prototyping. Maybe it's digital prototyping, right? So through simulation, through testing, through validation, through those kinds of things. But that's another important part of the product lifecycle. That if we've got a PLM system, maybe it helps us out with it. Maybe we've got some other systems that help with that. But it's an important step because you want to test the product before you decide that's the one that we're really going to make. Now maybe our caveman does real world testing, and if he gets eaten, that's the end of the product line. But there's probably lots of good places where it is.
Not if he had a family. It was a family business.
That's right.
The son's been helping him out the whole time, so we're good.
The son will carry on when the test fails and he gets stomped by the mammoth. But that simulation and validation piece, I think, is important because it ties back into the change management that we talked about earlier also, right? That a lot of times is integral to that process. I think there's another piece that's worth talking about there when we're talking about change and making a big one, a short one, that kind of thing. It may be important to recognize the common components that things share, right? And this is maybe a little advanced for our caveman, but certainly happens plenty today. When you say, look, I want a family of products, right? I'd like the, ultra clean line spears that, are meant for your larger than average saber-tooth tiger, but there's a short, a medium, a long, there's a black tip, a silver tip, a this, that, and the other. But that planning a product family to know that, well, I'm going to use the same grass no matter what, and I'm going to change out the tip, and I'm going to change out the length of the spear, and those kinds of things. Understanding that when you're planning a family of products is another important part of the life cycle. Not everybody does that, right? But that's one of the things that we see in organizations that try and scale and try and offer products that'll fit every need, is they think about products in families or in product lines. So that's, I think, another one that does fit, maybe not with my analogy quite as well, but it fits inside of the product lifecycle.
Now, does once the product has been, I hesitate to use the word manufactured when we're talking about caveman, but once it's been manufactured and it's, folks are out there using it, what happens if, what, that one broke off inside the animal and it's gone? Or, this rock fell off. It's, basically it's, I need it repaired. I need it fixed.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And I'm going to go back to manufacturing in a minute anyway, because I do think the cavemen did have manufacturing, but we'll go back to that in a minute. I think to that point about repair, though, and fixing things, yeah. I mean, that's part of the life cycle for some products, not all. Some people make products that they don't intend to repair. It's, dispose of it, recycle it, buy a new one, that kind of thing. But if there is repair, then yeah, you do want to think about what's the replacement part? What's the upgrade part, right? So that's another important piece of the life cycle, is the post-sale activities that might get done. And that is handled by a lot of PLM systems. When you think about service bills of material or repair bills of material, spare parts, things like that almost need to be designed with the original product, right? So when you do it, point in time might change, whether, you do it after you're having failures in the field and you're losing spears in mammoths, or whether you do it up front because you think you might, so you want to sell extra spear tips. So, you design it along with the product to start with. But I want to go back to the manufacturing, because I think there's another fun caveman story here, which is, how do you make the spear? Okay, it's a stick and a rock and some grass. It's not that hard, right? Well, it is until, you involve your brother-in-law in manufacturing, and he's not so bright. So, he he tries to put the rock on the stick, and then he tries to sharpen the rock. No, Billy, come on. It's sharpen the rock first, then tie it to the stick. Come on. But I mean, it's an important thing in our little joke about this. It's an important thing in the life of the product to think about how it's going to get made. Not everybody thinks this is necessarily part of the product life cycle, but I'll argue it is, that you have to think about your process planning. How do you make the product? Not just what are you making, but how are you going to make it? And maybe where are you getting the goods from, right? This rock versus that rock. All right, well, Jim over at Tribe X across the river, he's offered to sell me some really nice rocks, but they're kind of brittle. And I was getting some good ones from Sally over at the other set of caves, and hers are much better. So, which rock do I want? What supplier am I interested in? If I can't get them from Sally, does her sister Sue also offer rocks? I'm being silly, but all those things are part of your product life cycle when you think about components, standard components that you might buy. Who do you buy them from? What specifications do those meet? Are they an acceptable alternate in your bill of materials? Or is that something you only figure out when you're in manufacturing and you run short of inventory? So these are all things that might come up in product lifecycle.
Or your prototypes are out in the field.
Yeah.
I do think it's important to talk about supply chain management for our caveman, because, realistically, he cannot be doing all of these things. He cannot be going out and finding the rocks and finding the sticks and finding the grass. He's got to be assembling it. So maybe he picks the thing that he does best, as well as the assembly, and then outsources the rest. So I think it's definitely very valid there.
That's an underrated part of PLM also, Jen, which is division of labor, or coordination of labor, whatever you want to call it. But very few products are brought to market by one person. Maybe none, right? And different people need to play different roles in the process, even when cavemen were making spears, because Bob the brother-in-law is making them because Jim the caveman is too busy designing the next one. So that's one thing in PLM we have to pay attention to is how do different people contribute to the life cycle? And that's where PLM systems help a lot of people because you can stay coordinated. You can do things in parallel. You can all be working with the most up-to-date information. And that's critical in the life cycle of a product. And it's people often realize where they have a problem that means they want a PLM system or they need something to help them because they run into those challenges of, I was working with outdated data. I was working with the wrong version. That causes big problems. So it makes perfect sense to talk about that topic.
Well, and I think, and I think it's, so, it's a good time to start talking about the difference between PLM and PLM systems. Up until this point, it's been our caveman. He is managing the life cycle of his product. He's not doing it in a PLM system. So obviously, fast forward a couple billion years, and we're at the point that we do have PLM systems out there to coordinate the flow of data. I mean, to your point, the other day we were talking about you could do all of this in Excel,
right?
But I think when was the last time you lost an Excel file, got a corrupt Excel file, and then all of your data is gone? So let's spend a little bit of time talking about PLM systems.
That's a great question, and I think I'll answer it with sort of a composite view in my mind, right? Without talking about any particular system I know, because I know quite a few PLM systems, and some of them have unique functions and lots of them have tons of overlap. But just as kind of an overview, I think the things that I would say we see in PLM systems that people can expect to look for or should be thinking about, the first thing I would start with is an underlying organization and security model. Everything else that I'm going to mention here in a few minutes needs to sort of be built on this organization security model. For some systems, that might be like a folder system or a project system, so that the rest of the data gets organized by project or folder or product line or however you do it. But there's got to be some way of organizing the data in the system and securing it so that you have different roles, different users of different types can see different things, so that people can see one project's data but not another, or one folder's data, not another. But that whole setup of how you segment, organize, secure, and make available data, that's the first thing, right? Because as a collaboration tool, you have to be able to do that. So that's one. I think the next one, but you know what, before I move on past that one that's something that's important to note there is regulatory control and things like export control. Not every system has it, but a lot of them do. It's like the next level beyond just basic security. You have to think about that one too, because again, protecting all the rest of the data, it may be really important to secure that information.
Yeah, if you're going to collaborate with someone, you want to be able to share just enough data that they need to do their piece of the work without sharing, whether it's intellectual property or, to your point, like export controlled materials. You have to protect all of that. You have to organize and protect.
And I think once you have that framework, then you can start to build functional capabilities on top of it. And the kinds of things that I see that loosely map to our caveman story, I'll start at the front end and say, well, requirements, right? You have to manage requirements, and sometimes that's structures of requirements, and sometimes that's how they're going to be tested later, but understanding, what does the product need to meet or measure up to? So requirements management is an important area of a PLM system. I think another piece is document management. You can have documents for all kinds of reasons. And as we get more and more digital, maybe we'll need fewer and fewer documents if we're lucky. But documents hold all kinds of product information, and we need to make sure that we're managing them. They could be related to lots of other functional areas that we might talk about, design and bills of material and all those kinds of things. But that's an important one. Another piece that maybe should have gone along with that first bit about organization and security, because it's kind of a fundamental to the whole platform, is revision management. We have to be able to keep track of different versions of things, all the rest of the things that we're talking about. Now, not everything in the system is going to get a version, right? So like the folders and the projects and the things that organize a system, they may not get versions. They might, who knows? But certainly documents and then other data like CAD data, bill of material data, those things we're going to talk about, they all need to have revisions. so that you can tell one from another. When you change it over time, you want to keep the history of what you did, but you want to be able to differentiate it, not lose the old one, but know which one's the latest. So that kind of revision control capability is really essential. I think the one that everybody thinks of, because frankly, this is sort of how PLM systems got their start, Freudian slip, because I was going to talk about PDM, is with design management. So whether that's electrical CAD, mechanical CAD, optical, thermal, pneumatic systems, whatever it might be, managing that design data is important. It's a key functionality of a PLM system. And what really makes it PLM beyond PDM is then connecting it to other pieces of data. So one of the ones we mentioned already, requirements. Can you connect that design data back to the requirements and say, well, this thing is this size or it functions in this way because of that requirement? So maybe that's another fundamental capability is linkages, relationships, things like that. You may want functionally specific linkages like requirements to design, but overall the system has to be able to tie data together. That's another important piece of product lifecycle management systems. I think just right after design management, you have to talk about bill of material management, because the designs are often going to create some sort of list of components or groupings of components with quantities, with specifications that leads us to a bill of material. Now, usually that's an engineering bill of material, so let's differentiate there. Engineering bills of material, EBOMs, some people would call them, that's an important functionality. Lots of PLM systems are also going to have MBOMs, or manufacturing bills of material, because I'd say hardly anyone actually makes their product in the same set of steps that they use to define their product. So if they put components in subassemblies when they're designing it, that's probably not the same grouping of components they use when they're putting it together on the assembly line or buying it or doing whatever they do there. So EBOMs and MBOMs are often organized very differently, and it's important that PLM systems can manage them both and connect them. That's another really subtle thing, but something I see in a lot of PLM systems, and I think it's really important that you want to tie the two together, because people get tripped up there sometimes when the EBOM is one place and the MBOM is another, and they don't have a way to relate them.
You had mentioned earlier that very rarely does anybody create a product where they do everything. So again, this is, does that factor into the MBOM as far as these are parts that are coming from other people, other suppliers?
That's a great time to dig into it.
Is that in the MBOM or is that somewhere else?
Maybe, right? I mean, it certainly could be that you specify something in the EBOM that's actually going to be designed and built by someone else. So in the EBOM, it looks like one part, but in the MBOM, it looks like 20, because you've handed it off to, a tier one supplier who's gone off and designed the thing, and they're going to provide it to you, but they're going to provide you all the parts. You're going to put it together. So in your MBOM, it's got 20 parts. In your EBOM, it's got one. That's one example. There's plenty of those, though. You're bringing up a great point to remember about the PLM system, which is different people are going to play different roles and work with this data. So somebody who's making an MBOM may need to consume all of those parts or components that were created in the EBOM. So maybe there's an engineer making EBOM components, and there's a manufacturing engineer consuming EBOM components in their MBOM. And that happens all over the place as we're trying to collaborate and develop a product faster together, because different people work on different pieces of it. And I think, another example there is our specifications, right? You might have a component engineer who's working to make sure we're buying exactly the right part. Some kind of architect or designer is putting all the parts together roughly and saying generally what they need, but somebody's paying a lot of attention to, wait, does that chip have lead or tin in leads? Is it going to be rated in a radioactive environment? The things that they care about. So specifications ties back to document management, but there are often processes around it. So there's another great one in terms of PLM system capabilities. Process management. I don't mean manufacturing process, but I mean engineering process, design process, product development process. So lots of PLM systems are going to have some sort of workflow or process engine that lets people define the steps they need to follow in their process and link all these other data types that we've mentioned to that and route those around to the right people to do the right job at the right time. To say, oh, I'm going to specify that component. Oh, I'm going to release that part. I'm going to, these are the steps we need to do to get to the point where the product is ready to make. One of the processes there that we touched on back with our caveman earlier is change management and change control. That ties to a bunch of these features or functionalities we've talked about, right? If you've got design data, if you've got bill of material data, maybe requirements data, and you've been iterating and developing it and creating multiple versions within your project area that you're working on, but it's time to go make the thing, you're going to want to release it. So there might be some life cycle even to these elements in the PLM system that you want to release them. And then you find a mistake and you say, oh, but I've got to change it. So I need to revise it and make a new version. All of that should happen under the governance of some process, a change management process. Call it what you will. Some people call it ECR, ECO, ECN. But that's a functionality that you want to have in the PLM because it's tied into all that other data that's already there and it relates to all those other pieces of information. We just keep coming up with things. There's lots of things in a PLM system.
I wonder if one of the foundational aspects of a PLM system is because it doesn't do everything. PLM doesn't do everything. It does need to interface with other systems, ideally, in a digital way rather than in a very manual way. Is one of the foundational aspects of a PLM system a way to access the data in it, an API or an interface to that, so that you can get data out, put data in?
Touchy question. I think it should be. I think if you asked every PLM system vendor that question, they would all say, yes, absolutely. And then they would do it very differently. So I do think it's an important capability if your PLM system is going to help you with your digital thread, right? And tie your product information to information in other business systems, then it should be open or accessible in some way so that you can tie the digital bits and pieces in your PLM to other systems. So you do want APIs, you do want behaviors and access to that engine under the hood. I did think of one more functionality though that I don't want to forget before we move on. Another important one that a lot of PLM systems offer is project management or program management, or some would even call it portfolio management. But the functionality I'm describing here is the ability to control the activities around the life of the product, around development of the product, whatever part of its life you're in, that happen amongst a team of people, right? So tasks and actions and maybe phases and gates and however you run activities or projects inside your organization, the ability to capture those and have visibility of those connected to all this other stuff we've talked about. There's a term that I love here called invisible governance, meaning if you are tracking those kinds of activities in a PLM system with the rest of the product data that gets tracked in PLM, then you get this invisible layer of governance where you can know what's going on. Because just take an example here. If you've got a task in a project plan that's assigned to an engineer to release a drawing, and that's the last step that needs to be done before you know, all right, that product is ready. It's ready for manufacturing. All right, well, you're very keenly interested in when that happens and when you're ready, what the status of the project is. Well, if you've connected all the right pieces inside of a PLM system, and this IT tool's got everything automated the way you want, then when the change process that's meant to release the drawing reaches its final step, then the system says, all right, release the drawing, because the drawing's connected to that change process. The drawing gets released, and then the drawing was connected back to this task in the project plan that said, all right, release the drawing. And then that task shows as 100% complete. And when that last task is 100% complete, it rolls up to the phase, which is now 100% complete. And maybe an alert is sent to the manager of that phase who says, you're done. Well, I didn't have to call anybody or ask anybody about the status. Through invisible governance, because it's all connected in the system, I know when things are happening and I can see instantly where things stand. I think that's another important piece of product lifecycle management systems that helps people do what they're trying to do with their product when they're developing it. It's a big helper, I guess, in my mind. So that's another functional piece I think is important.
So what else? I mean, is there like, you've got your product, it's developed, it's out there, it's manufactured, you just released it. Now what?
Yeah.
Is there a management of like repair or data that's coming back out from the field? Anything along that? Is that a piece of PLM?
I think that's an interesting question. And I think different vendors today have different views about that, right? Where does PLM end? And where do other systems pick up? And I think that there is a piece in PLM around planning for, post-manufacture, post-sale, that kind of thing. And for a lot of folks, it's the same functionality that we talked about in other areas, right? Whether it's you're talking about parts and spare parts, right? Well, that's the same as some of what you're doing in a bill of material or a repair bill of material, or a repair plan. Well, that might be a lot like a manufacturing process plan that you might generate. So I think that, yes, those are pieces of the life cycle of the product that fit into PLM. I don't know that they necessarily generate new functionalities or new capabilities, or their existing capabilities that I think get used at different stages of the product's life. Now, where that can get interesting, I think, is when you start talking about data that really comes from the field and IoT, and where does IoT fit in with PLM? And that's probably a topic for another time. But I don't think PLM systems are meant to manage IoT data, but in the product's life, when it's actually out in use in the real world, what does the PLM system have to do with that? How does it fit? And for me, that's still an open question because people are figuring that out as we speak.
I think one place that it fits is exactly what I'm saying. Like when something's broken, particularly, I live in Cincinnati. GE Aircraft Engines is just right down the street. I have several friends that work there. And when I've tried to explain to my family what PLM means, what a PLM system does, I use the example that she told me is basically when an engine part fails, they have to be able to go back and track all of the data about that single piece of the component, or of the assembly rather. So they have to be able to find out how it was designed. Was it ever out of spec? What were the simulation results? Could this have been prevented, predicted, et cetera? Where was it manufactured? Is there anything particularly an additive? Was there any other pieces of, were there any other components in that same batch that now we should really take another look at? So it's basically connecting all of that data, storing and connecting and being able to retrieve all of the data about that part.
I think that makes perfect sense, right? My answer was probably more along the lines of, how much of working on it, solving the problem do you do in PLM? And that might lead to more design changes or things like that. But your point is a great one, which is even after the product's sold and it's in service, just the search function, the relationship search function, the ability to trace the relationships, know where things were used, knowing bills of material that maybe are not the E-BOM or the M-BOM, but are perhaps the as-built bill of material, the as-maintained bill of material, those kinds of things. And again, this gets into some PLM systems are going to help you manage this and some aren't, but it's an important capability to note that being able to maintain all of those relationships, if it's important to your product's life to have those, then gives you those other important capabilities, right? The where used, the search, the things that you can look up when there is a problem and know what was impacted so that you can run it to ground and solve it for other people or other products that might still be in the field. So I think I'm glad you added that, Jen. That's an important point.
Okay, Jonathan. So we've gone through a lot of the different pieces and parts, not just of PLM, which you drew the distinction that you don't have to have a system to do PLM, but we finished up by going through a lot of the different pieces of a PLM system. Just real quickly for our user or for our listeners before we sign off here, can you just run through a quick list of what those components are, what to think about when you're looking for a PLM system?
Sure. Yeah, if you try and just boil it down, it can be fairly straightforward. I think you're looking for a system that can organize the data and it's got some kind of fundamental things that it can do across all the types of data you're interested in. So it's got to be able to secure it and track it, maintain history, track revisions of all the different things, segment it so that certain people can see things and other people can't. Like Those are what I'd call kind of like platform capabilities that it can do. And then in a bunch of different areas, I think there are specific capabilities, right? So there's like requirements management, there's document management, there's design data management, things like CAD files, MCAD, ECAD, systems engineering, all the design, authoring tools, managing that data. There's bill of material management, and I think there are flavors of that. There's EBOM, MBOM, perhaps unit BOM. It depends on what you're looking for, but different bills of material management, maybe different structures that get related to each other. And then I would say process management, right? So a lot of times that's engineering change. So ECR, ECO, ECN, that kind of thing. And then project or program management, the ability to manage the tasks and activities and connect it back to all the other stuff. There are probably a few, add-ons here and there, little variances, like in bill of material, like materials compliance related to bills of material, more regulatory compliance. So there are little variants for different industries, but I think that's kind of the short list.
It sounds like PLM and PLM systems can do a lot, manage the entire life cycle of the product, right?
No doubt.
So we've been talking today about what is PLM and what are PLM systems. And you've just gone through a long list of functions within them. Do you have to have a PLM system?
That's a great question. I think there are lots of people out there getting things done, making and selling products who do not have a PLM system. They're clearly doing PLM, like we talked about at the beginning, but they're doing it with a collection of tools, right? Maybe they've got a CAD system and they use Excel for their bill of material and they use email for their engineering change process, those kinds of things. So you don't have to have a PLM system to get it done. I think it really helps, right? If you're trying to grow and scale your business and grow your product lines and things like that, it's very tough to do. It's very tough to manage all the complexity and the concurrency of the changes, the new product releases, the calls you get from the shop floor with discrepancies about what's getting made. It's very difficult to juggle all of that for a bunch of product lines all at the same time if you don't have a system to help you keep track of it. It's very easy to get lost in your spreadsheets and pick up the wrong one and, buy the wrong part, that kind of thing. So I don't think you have to have a PLM system, but more and more these days, as digitalization speeds things up, I think you really want one.
It sure helps.
Thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. This is your podcast as much as it is ours, and we welcome your feedback and ideas on what topics you'd like to see our team cover in a future podcast. Please share your thoughts and questions with us by sending an email to podcast@razorleaf.com, and we will share your comments on a future show. Thanks again, and have a great week. Stay sharp.